They say that sometimes the most innocent gestures can reveal the deepest betrayals, but I never expected that my wife's sudden interest in learning a new language would expose her systematic deception and lead me to orchestrate a revenge so devastating that it destroyed not just her affair, but her entire carefully constructed web of lies. My name is Nicholas, and this is the story of how discovering my wife's true motivations for studying Spanish led me to expose her infidelity in the most comprehensive way possible. My wife Isabella and I had been married for 6 years when she announced that she wanted to learn Spanish. Isabella had always been interested in languages and cultures, so her decision to take Spanish classes seemed like a natural extension of her intellectual curiosity and desire for personal growth. Isabella enrolled in evening Spanish classes at a local community college and began spending several nights a week attending lessons. She was enthusiastic about her studies and would often practice Spanish phrases around the house, asking me to help her with pronunciation and vocabulary. I was supportive of her educational goals and proud of her commitment to learning something new. The Spanish classes seemed to energize Isabella in ways I hadn't seen in years. She was more animated in conversations, more engaged with life, and seemed to have found a new sense of purpose and excitement. She would come home from her classes with stories about her classmates and her progress in mastering the language. As Isabella became more involved with her Spanish studies, she began to mention a particular instructor named Carlos who taught advanced conversation classes. Carlos was apparently a native Spanish speaker from Mexico who had extensive experience teaching language and culture. Isabella spoke about Carlos with obvious admiration for his teaching methods and cultural knowledge. I was initially pleased that Isabella had found such engaging classes and had connected with an instructor who inspired her learning. The Spanish studies seemed to be fulfilling for her in ways that her previous hobbies had not been, and I appreciated that she was challenging herself intellectually and culturally. However, after several months of Isabella's intensive Spanish studies, I began to notice some changes in her behavior and schedule that seemed unusual. She was spending increasingly long hours at the college, often not returning home until very late in the evening. Her explanations for these extended absences were always related to additional study sessions, cultural events, or conversation practice groups. Isabella also began to receive frequent phone calls and text messages in Spanish that she would take privately, often stepping into another room or going outside to have these conversations. When I asked about these calls, she would explain that they were practice conversations with her classmates or discussions about homework assignments. Most concerning of all, Isabella began to be less communicative about the specific details of her Spanish studies. While she had initially shared her progress and excitement about learning the language, she became more vague about her activities and seemed reluctant to discuss what she was doing during her extended time at the college. These explanations seemed reasonable at first, and I trusted Isabella's commitment to her education and her desire to become fluent in Spanish. I assumed that her increased privacy and longer hours were simply the result of taking her studies more seriously and advancing to higher levels of instruction. But as more time passed, I began to feel that Isabella's Spanish studies were consuming an unusually large portion of her time and attention. She was rarely home during evenings and weekends, and when she was home, she seemed distracted and preoccupied with language-related matters. I also noticed that Isabella had become more secretive about her phone and computer usage. She would close her laptop when I entered the room, and she had started keeping her phone with her at all times, even taking it into the bathroom. These behaviors seemed inconsistent with someone who was simply taking language classes. When I mentioned my concerns about the amount of time Isabella was spending on her Spanish studies, she became defensive and suggested that I didn't understand the importance of immersive language learning. She accused me of being unsupportive of her educational goals and implied that I was being possessive by wanting more of her time and attention. This response troubled me because it was unlike Isabella to be so dismissive of my concerns or to suggest that I was unsupportive of her learning. Throughout our marriage, I had always encouraged her educational pursuits and personal growth, and I had never complained about the time she spent on her interests. I decided to take a more active interest in Isabella's Spanish studies to better understand what was requiring so much of her time and energy. I offered to help her practice conversation, to attend cultural events with her, and to support her learning in any way I could. Isabella's reaction to my offer was surprisingly negative. She claimed that her instructor had strict policies about outside interference in the learning process and that having me involved would actually hinder her progress. She suggested that it would be better for her to continue her studies independently without my participation. This response seemed unusual because most language instructors encourage students to practice with native speakers and family members, and they welcome any additional support for their students' learning. Isabella's reluctance to involve me in her Spanish studies raised questions about what she was actually doing during the time she claimed to be in classes. I decided to conduct some research into Isabella's Spanish classes to learn more about the program and to understand what kind of instruction she was receiving. What I discovered was shocking and revealed the extent of Isabella's deception. When I contacted the community college to inquire about their Spanish program, I learned that Isabella was not currently enrolled in any Spanish classes. The registrar's office had no record of her taking courses during the current semester, and they had never heard of an instructor named Carlos teaching in their language department. This discovery was devastating because it meant that Isabella had been lying to me about her Spanish classes for months. She had been using language learning as a cover story for activities that she was hiding from me, and she had been systematically deceiving me about how she was spending her time. I realized that Isabella's supposed Spanish studies were actually an elaborate cover for an affair. The long hours, the secretive phone calls in Spanish, the defensive behavior, and the reluctance to involve me in her activities all made sense when viewed as attempts to hide an extramarital relationship. The most painful aspect of this discovery was understanding that Isabella had been exploiting my respect for education and my support for her personal growth to cover up her betrayal. She had been using my admiration for her learning goals to justify her absences and to deflect my questions about her behavior. I also realized that Carlos, the instructor Isabella had mentioned so frequently, was likely her affair partner. Her obvious admiration for his teaching methods and cultural knowledge had actually been descriptions of her romantic feelings for him, disguised as academic appreciation. I decided to gather more evidence of Isabella's affair before confronting her about her deception. I wanted to understand the full scope of her betrayal and to document her lies in a way that would make it impossible for her to deny or minimize what she had been doing. The investigation I conducted revealed the extent of Isabella's systematic deception. She had been meeting Carlos regularly at hotels, restaurants, and other locations while claiming to be attending Spanish classes. She had been using fake study sessions and cultural events as excuses to spend time with him, and she had been lying to me about virtually every aspect of her supposed language learning. I also discovered that Isabella and Carlos had been planning to leave their respective partners and start a new life together, possibly in Mexico where Carlos had family connections. They had been discussing travel plans, living arrangements, and strategies for ending their current relationships while maintaining their affair and deceiving their families. Most shocking of all, I learned that Isabella had been using our joint credit cards and bank accounts to fund her affair. She had been paying for hotel rooms, expensive dinners, and gifts for Carlos while telling me that the expenses were related to textbooks, tutoring, and educational materials. Isabella had been systematically stealing from our marriage to finance her betrayal, and she had been using language learning as a cover story to justify the missing money. She had been exploiting both my trust and our shared financial resources to support her affair. I realized that Isabella's deception went far beyond a simple affair. She had been running an elaborate con game that involved lying about her activities, stealing money from our accounts, and using education as a cover for her systematic betrayal of our marriage. I decided that Isabella needed to face consequences that would expose not just her affair, but the elaborate web of lies and theft she had constructed to hide it. I wanted her to understand that her deception had been discovered and documented, and that she would face appropriate consequences for her systematic betrayal. The plan I developed was designed to expose Isabella's affair and her lies in the most devastating and public way possible. I wanted her to lose not just our marriage, but also her reputation and her ability to continue deceiving people about her character and integrity. Phase 1 involved documenting every aspect of Isabella's deception, including her lies about Spanish classes, her theft of money from our accounts, and her systematic betrayal of our marriage. I wanted to create a comprehensive record of her dishonesty and manipulation. Phase 2 involved gathering evidence of Isabella's affair with Carlos, including photographs, communications, and witness statements that would prove the extent of their relationship and their plans to leave their partners. Phase 3 involved exposing Isabella's lies to the people who had been deceived by her fake language learning, including friends, family members, and colleagues who had supported what they believed were legitimate educational pursuits. Phase 4 was more personal and involved confronting Isabella with evidence of her affair and her systematic deception in a way that would force her to acknowledge the full scope of her betrayal. The final phase involved the legal and practical steps necessary to end our marriage, recover the money Isabella had stolen, and ensure that she faced appropriate consequences for her theft and deception. The investigation phase took several weeks, during which I worked with a private investigator to document Isabella's activities and gather evidence of her affair. We were able to photograph Isabella and Carlos together at hotels and restaurants, and we obtained records showing the pattern of their meetings over several months. We also gathered financial evidence showing how Isabella had been using our joint accounts to pay for her affair-related expenses. The credit card and bank records showed a clear pattern of charges for hotels, restaurants, and gifts that corresponded to her supposed Spanish study activities. Most importantly, we documented Isabella's lies about her language classes by obtaining statements from the community college confirming that she had never been enrolled in their Spanish program. We also gathered evidence showing how she had used fake study sessions and cultural events as cover stories for her affair. The confrontation happened on a Thursday evening in December, exactly 9 months after Isabella had first announced her intention to learn Spanish. I had arranged for Isabella to come home expecting a normal evening together, but I had prepared a comprehensive presentation of all the evidence I had gathered about her affair and her systematic deception. Instead of the quiet evening she expected, I presented Isabella with detailed documentation of her affair with Carlos, records of her lies about Spanish classes, and evidence of her theft from our joint accounts. I also had photographs and witness statements that proved the extent of her betrayal. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. I had financial records showing her theft, photographs proving her affair, and documentation showing her systematic lies about language learning. I also had evidence of her plans with Carlos to leave their partners and start a new life together. Isabella's reaction was initially one of shock and panic as she realized that her elaborate deception had been discovered and documented in detail. She tried to deny the evidence at first, claiming that I had misunderstood her relationship with Carlos and that her Spanish studies were legitimate. But the evidence was too comprehensive and specific for her denials to be credible. I had documentation showing not just her affair, but also her systematic lies, her theft of money, and her plans to abandon our marriage. When Isabella realized that denial wasn't working, she changed tactics and tried to justify her affair by claiming that our marriage had become stagnant and that she had found genuine passion and cultural connection with Carlos. She suggested that her deception had been necessary to protect my feelings while she explored her true desires. But I was not interested in Isabella's attempts to rationalize her systematic betrayal and theft. She had deliberately and maliciously deceived me for months, stolen money from our accounts, and used education as a cover for her affair. She needed to face the consequences of her actions. That evening, I also revealed that I had consulted with attorneys about my legal options for addressing Isabella's theft and adultery. I told her that I planned to pursue both divorce proceedings and civil remedies to recover the money she had stolen and to hold her accountable for her systematic deception. I explained that Isabella's use of our joint accounts to fund her affair constituted theft, and that her systematic lies about language learning constituted fraud. I wanted her to understand that she would face serious legal and financial consequences for her actions. Isabella was devastated to learn that her affair and theft could result in legal action and that she might face significant financial penalties for the damage she had caused. She begged me to handle the matter privately and suggested that we could resolve our problems through counseling rather than legal proceedings. But I had already made the decision that our marriage was over and that Isabella needed to face appropriate consequences for her systematic betrayal and theft. Her deception had been too extensive and malicious for me to consider reconciliation or private resolution. The legal and financial consequences for Isabella were swift and comprehensive. I filed for divorce immediately, citing her adultery and theft as grounds for the dissolution of our marriage. The evidence I had gathered provided clear documentation of her betrayal, making it impossible for her to contest the divorce or claim an equal share of our assets. I also filed civil lawsuits against Isabella for theft and fraud, seeking to recover all of the money she had stolen plus damages for the harm her actions had caused. The financial records showing her use of our joint accounts to fund her affair made these lawsuits straightforward and likely to succeed. Most importantly, I exposed Isabella's lies about language learning to our friends, family members, and colleagues. I shared the evidence showing that she had never actually been taking Spanish classes and that she had been using fake educational pursuits as a cover for her affair. The exposure of Isabella's deception was devastating to her reputation and her relationships. People who had admired her supposed commitment to learning and cultural exploration felt betrayed and manipulated when they learned that her activities had been fabricated. Friends and family members who had supported her educational goals were shocked to discover that they had been deceived. Isabella's affair partner Carlos also faced consequences when his partner learned about their relationship and their plans to leave for Mexico. Carlos's relationship ended, and his reputation in the community was severely damaged by the exposure of his affair with a married woman. The most satisfying aspect of Isabella's downfall was watching her realize that her elaborate deception had ultimately achieved the opposite of what she had intended. Instead of allowing her to maintain her affair while keeping our marriage intact, her lies had led to the complete destruction of both relationships and her reputation. Isabella had thought she was being clever by using language learning as a cover for her affair, exploiting my respect for education to justify her absences and deflect my questions. But she had failed to consider that her deception would eventually be discovered and that she would face serious consequences for her systematic betrayal. The divorce proceedings were decisive and comprehensive. Isabella's adultery and theft were well documented through the evidence I had gathered, and she had no grounds to contest the dissolution of our marriage or to claim a significant portion of our remaining assets. Isabella was forced to return all of the money she had stolen from our joint accounts, and she was also required to pay additional damages for the harm her theft had caused. The court recognized that her systematic deception had been particularly egregious because it had involved exploiting educational pursuits and cultural interests. Most importantly, I was able to rebuild my life and my financial security free from Isabella's deception and betrayal. The recovered money allowed me to restore our savings and to move forward with financial goals that her theft had delayed or prevented. The experience taught me valuable lessons about the importance of verifying claims about educational activities and being skeptical of explanations that seem designed to deflect questions or avoid scrutiny. I learned that people can exploit learning and cultural interests to cover up systematic deception. Looking back on this experience, I am proud of the way I handled the discovery of Isabella's affair and her systematic lies. I could have confronted her immediately when I first became suspicious, but instead I took the time to gather comprehensive evidence that exposed the full scope of her deception. The marriage that I had thought was built on shared values and mutual support for personal growth had actually been undermined by systematic lies and theft. But the process of exposing Isabella's betrayal had also revealed my own strength and resilience, and it had prepared me to build healthier relationships in the future. Isabella's affair and her elaborate deception had been interconnected crimes that had both damaged our marriage and violated the trust that was essential to our relationship. She had been willing to exploit education and cultural learning to cover up her betrayal, and she had used systematic lies to maintain her double life. The revenge I orchestrated against Isabella was comprehensive and devastating, but it was also necessary to protect my interests and ensure that justice was served. She had chosen to build her affair on stolen money and fabricated educational activities, and she had to face the full consequences of her choices. The financial records that had enabled Isabella's theft had also provided the evidence that exposed her affair and her systematic deception. The irony was not lost on me that the very accounts she had used to fund her betrayal had also documented her crimes and provided the proof needed to hold her accountable. In the end, Isabella's elaborate deception had achieved the opposite of what she had intended. Instead of allowing her to maintain her affair while preserving our marriage, her lies had ultimately cost her both relationships and had resulted in serious legal and financial penalties. The most important outcome of this entire experience was that I was able to reclaim my life and my financial security from Isabella's web of lies and theft. I was no longer living in a marriage built on deception and systematic betrayal, and I was free to build a new life based on honesty and integrity. The evidence that had exposed Isabella's affair served as a reminder that systematic deception ultimately leaves traces that can be discovered and documented. Her careful planning and elaborate cover stories had ultimately been no match for thorough investigation and analysis. Both Isabella and Carlos learned that affairs built on lies and theft come with consequences that extend far beyond the immediate passion they are meant to provide. They lost their relationships, their reputations, and their standing in the community. They discovered that the trust and love of their partners, once broken through systematic betrayal, could not be easily repaired or replaced. Their affair had destroyed not just their relationships, but also their connections with friends and family members who felt deceived by their lies. The revenge was complete, the truth was exposed, and I was finally free to build a new life based on the values of honesty and integrity that Isabella had abandoned. I had won not just a legal victory in the divorce and civil proceedings, but a moral victory that validated my commitment to truth and accountability in relationships. Looking forward, I carried with me the lessons I had learned about the importance of verifying claims about educational activities, the dangers of systematic deception disguised as personal growth, and the need to investigate suspicious patterns rather than accepting explanations at face value. The experience had been painful and financially damaging, but it had also been educational and ultimately liberating. I had learned that I was capable of handling systematic betrayal with strategic thinking and appropriate legal action, and I had proven to myself that I would not tolerate deception and theft even when disguised as educational pursuits. Isabella's story became a cautionary tale about the dangers of using education and cultural learning to cover up affairs, and about the way that systematic deception ultimately destroys not just the relationships it is meant to preserve, but the character and integrity of the people who choose lies over honesty. Her downfall served as a reminder that exploiting educational activities and cultural interests for personal gain is ultimately unsustainable and self-destructive, and that systematic deception ultimately destroys not just the marriages it is meant to preserve, but the reputation and standing of the people who choose betrayal over commitment. The joint accounts that had been meant to represent our shared financial partnership had instead become the funding source for Isabella's affair and the evidence I needed to expose her crimes and reclaim my future. In the end, the revenge was not just about recovering the money Isabella had stolen or exposing her affair. It was about vindicating the principles of honesty, marital commitment, and educational integrity that she had abandoned, and about proving that systematic deception will ultimately be discovered and punished. The marriage that Isabella had destroyed through her lies and theft was replaced by a new understanding of what genuine relationships should look like, built on transparency, mutual respect, and shared commitment to honesty in all aspects of life. Her betrayal had been devastating, but it had also been educational, and I was determined to use those lessons to build better relationships in the future based on the values that truly mattered to me. Isabella's affair and theft, and the elaborate deception she had constructed to cover her crimes, had ultimately cost her everything that should have mattered to her: her marriage, her reputation, and her standing in the community. The financial records that exposed her theft and the evidence that documented her lies served as permanent reminders that truth has a way of revealing itself, no matter how carefully people try to hide their deception behind educational activities and cultural pursuits. The revenge was complete, justice was served, and I was finally free to move forward with my life, knowing that I had handled one of the most sophisticated forms of marital betrayal with dignity, strategic thinking, and unwavering commitment to truth and legal accountability.